Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's Casual Friday, I have tidbits. I have a surprise gift that came in the mail from my cousin that I want to share with you. I want to show you an experiment that I did while traveling on my road trip in the past couple of weeks. And I want to share with you what my next vintage project will be and what I've been doing to prepare for it. So let's get started. This first tidbit is one I meant to share with you last week, but when I was on the road, it completely slipped my mind. I have an article in the new issue of Interweave Knits, Quick and Easy Knits. This is volume 2. So this is a new magazine. It's digital only that Interweave is producing that's aimed at newer knitters. So the projects are easier, they're more basic. And the article that I have in the magazine is one on, and it's an introduction to reading knitting charts. So it's really the basics, the bare basics of reading charts. I do have videos that I've done on how to read charts, and I'll link to that playlist above and then down in the show notes. But this particular issue is available free until July 23rd. So you can download that digital magazine and have it on your device. I had a couple of questions and comments about using YouTube and accessibility issues on my channel in the past couple of weeks. So I want to address those with this particular tidbit. So the first one was about closed captions. Somebody had commented last weekend that there weren't any closed captions on my last week's Casual Friday. And what it was they just hadn't been generated yet. They're automatically generated when I upload a video, but it can take a couple of days. Usually, closed captions are available within 24 hours, sometimes less. Once in a while, it might take 2 days or even 3. And I think in this case, it took 3 days before the closed captions had been generated. So I don't have any control over how quickly that they get generated, but they do get generated eventually. So there's nothing, I didn't turn them off or forget to enable them. They automatically happen. If you've never seen the closed captions, just tap or mouse over the video playback area and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a CC if closed captions are available, and you just click on that and the closed captions will come up. If you need to see them in a different language than whatever your default is or however you have them set, then there's a little gear icon at the bottom of the video playback area that you can click on, and then you can choose what language you want to auto-translate your closed captions into. So that's always available. It just sometimes takes a couple of days. The second question I had was, how can you access comments on a video if you're using a tablet? So every type of device presents the YouTube experience in a different way. So if you're on a computer, it's not the same as if you're on a mobile device. And I don't even think that the phone and a tablet are the same. But if you're on a tablet and you're holding it in a portrait mode, and that means up and down like this, turn it sideways like that. That's a landscape view. And then you should be able to see the description of the video and also the comments. If you're holding it in this portrait view like this, you will need to scroll past all of those little thumbnails of recommended videos that YouTube is putting up on your screen. Scroll to the bottom past those and you'll see them. But you can get to them. It's just done a little bit differently than if you are on a computer. This tidbit actually came to me from my husband. He sent me a link to this. He said, I'm sure you know about this already, and I hadn't. But by the time I was preparing for Casual Friday, yesterday I got my weekly newsletter from the Wool channel, and Clara Parkes had mentioned this video as well. Apparently went viral. For some reason it didn't come up in my Twitter feed, But what it is a drone video. So it was taken from really high up of some sheep. It was a flock of like 1,000 to 1,700 sheep that were being moved to their summer pasture. The photographer is an Israeli photographer, and he does a lot of photography related to agriculture, like crops and plowing and harvesting and all that kind of thing. But he'd been following this particular flock of sheep for a couple of months. Speaking of Clara Parkes and summer pastures, Clara has started a new podcast, and her first guest was a woman who's known as the Swiss Shepherdess. So she's a first-generation farmer, and I believe it's goats, not sheep. But the interview was done the day before they were getting ready to move their livestock to their summer pasture up in the mountains, which I thought was kind of interesting. They do that in different places, I guess. In Idaho, there's a moving of the sheep from one place to another that occurred recently, and people will show up to watch it because they close the roads down. I'm going to leave a link to Clara's podcast, this one in particular, so that you can listen to that conversation and perhaps even subscribe to her podcast. This tidbit is a couple more of these phrases that we use in our everyday language that come from textiles. So these I have two of them, and they came from different viewers. The first one came from Kim, and she mentioned that she really likes that term dressed to the nines, that's a really common phrase that you hear about fashion and dress wear and things like that. So I looked it up. I found a blog post that talked about this expression and the possibilities of where this came from. There have been a lot of theories over the years about where this came from, and what they pointed out in the blog post was there's no evidence. People are like, well, maybe it came from this. What they can look for in written language going back in time is that the word nine or nines often meant extreme or the top or the most or something like that. And so being dressed to the nines means being really like dressed glamorously and sort of at the top. So it's the expression to the nines that we need to look at when we're thinking about this particular phrase. And again, I will leave a link to that particular blog post so you can read about all the different theories that people have had over the years about where this phrase came from. Now, the second one that I found super fascinating because this came from Elizabeth Kronkvist. She left this in the comments, I believe, of the video. She had a couple of different phrases that are in Swedish that come from textiles. She said there's a proverb that basically means much ado about nothing. And the way it translates is, lots of screams and little wool, said the old woman when she sheared the pig. So if you just picture that in your mind, you can understand where that would come from and why it would mean much ado about nothing. The second expression that she talked about, go on in your wool stockings. And what that means is that sort of if you have a determination and you really energetic perseverance to keep going along with something, that phrase, go on in your wool stockings, is used. What she said, though, she gave some backstory to that. And she said, it relates to pre-modern distance measure called Navarhumil is how I heard it pronounced from Google Translate. I'll put the word on the screen here. But those words literally translate to birch bark shoe distance. She said it relates to the mileage you might expect to get if you were wearing birch bark shoes. Typically be maybe 10 imperial miles. And so what do you do if your shoes wear out and there's no trees around that you can make new shoes with? You go on in your wool stockings. So thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Kim, for your contributions to this week's tidbit on textile phrases. I really appreciate it. This last tidbit came to me in a direct message on Ravelry from Adam. He apparently was doing some searching on, I think, knitting gloves and using knitting machines, and this video was recommended to him, and he thought I might be interested, and I certainly was, and I thought you guys might be as well. It's a documentary about a Japanese knitting machine company. And it's been in business for, I think, about 50 years. The owner, the CEO, is still in charge, and he started it when he was in his 20s, and he's like in his mid-70s now. And he's really kept on top of the technology. So they manufacture knitting machines meant for industrial purposes. So for clothing companies that need knitting machines to produce their goods. And they were demonstrating this really cool proprietary design software that they had developed that allows them to say, they showed an example of designing a dress on the computer rather than having to do it in paper. So they designed the shapes, and then they have this huge dictionary of stitch patterns that they can go through, and they can apply those stitch patterns to the fabric and change them around however they want in their design. And then they save it to a flash drive, and they take the flash drive over to this really fancy knitting machine, which whenever the documentary was made, they were saying it was like a $120,000 knitting machine. They hook up all the yarn that's going to be needed, and this machine just makes the whole thing. It's like done in one piece. There's no seams. It's done. It's all the shaping, all the stitch patterning, everything is done. And so they were saying that from the time that the designer was creating it on her computer screen, which obviously she had pre-planned it. She wasn't like coming up with her idea then. But from the time that they started doing it on the screen, did all of the work to create the stitch patterns, took it over to the machine, and then had the machine do it, it was 36 minutes had passed. So it was this cute little red dress that had shaping, had waist shaping, it had these cables down the front, and it had a flared skirt and sleeves and everything. It was done completely in the round, all in one piece, and it's pretty amazing. So if you're interested in seeing that and seeing this documentary, I'll leave that link down below. Last week, I was filming Casual Friday in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We were on our way back from Scottsdale, Arizona, where we had visited my father-in-law, and we were staying with my mother-in-law. So we were actually in Santa Fe twice. We were in Santa Fe on our way to Scottsdale for a couple of days, and then we stopped in Santa Fe on our way back from Scottsdale. So recorded Casual Friday there, and then on Saturday morning, we left back from Minneapolis, and we got home Sunday afternoon. It's a long drive. If you don't live in the U.S., you don't really get sometimes how far things are. It's a couple thousand miles in each direction in order to make this trip, which is going to be even more kilometers. On Monday, we got our mail delivered, and there were two packages. One of them was a package of yarn that I'd ordered while I was in Santa Fe the first time. I'd visited a yarn shop called Acer Santa Fe, and I wanted some Germantown yarn. It's from Kelbourne Woolen Mills. And I loved this one color. She had 6 skeins of it, but there was 2 different dye lots. And so she said, I can order you enough of the same. And I said, oh, well, if you're going to order it, I want 7 of them just for safety. I didn't have a plan for the yarn, but it's a sweater's worth of yarn, and I knew that I had wanted to try this particular yarn on a sweater. So I was really happy to be able to get that. But the second package, I had no idea what it was, and I didn't know who had sent it because it had a return address but no name on the return address. And I thought, did I order something? What is this? So I open it up. Inside is this. So vintage knitting book. Maybe I ordered that, but it didn't look familiar. Like I didn't go, oh yeah, I ordered that. Did not look familiar. And why would somebody send it in a box? Like it seemed so weird. So I took it out of the box, and then inside was this little package that was had like this white foam kind of tape wrapped around it, like insulation, to keep it from being damaged. And then it was taped all over it. So I didn't have any idea what was in this little bundle. And then there were some photographs in the bottom of the box. And I thought, this is so weird. And I picked them up and I started looking through them. I'm like, oh, this is my cousin Daniel. So he's actually, I think he's my third cousin. So we share a great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather. I met him. I've never met him in person. I might get to meet him this summer. He's coming up for a family reunion on his mother's side, which is different than how I'm related to him. But they lived here in Minnesota. This is going to be up further north. I might get to see him, and we might get to go to some cemeteries together and look for headstones together, which I love doing. So I've never met him in person, but he loves collecting photographs of ancestors, but he will also collect them. Like if he sees them at estate sales, he'll buy them and then see if he can, if there's names on the back, I'll try to track down who the relatives might be for those people. So he really likes to collect living cousins and then ask them if they have photographs of the mutual ancestors. He just loves doing that. And I love doing the research on the dead people. So we make a good pair, because I've done a lot of research in correcting the family tree that had been built prior. So he has this interest in all things related to dead people. And one of the things that he does is he has a booth at an antique mall. And I just didn't know that the package was from him, because he's moved a couple times in the past year and now lives in Pennsylvania. And that's why I had no idea who this could be from. And I talked to him a couple of months ago, connected with him, and I said, oh, if you come across any, vintage knitting patterns, with sweaters in them, let me know. And so he said, oh, I have one. And the other thing he said, I think this has to do with knitting. And he had this darning mushroom. And so I'll show you overhead what this looks like, because it is beautiful. I was just so happy to get that. It was really unexpected. So this is the darning mushroom that I got from my cousin Daniel that he sent to me. It's got a nice weight to it. It has this kind of flat surface here, so you can put your fabric across here. Some darning mushrooms will have like a groove that goes around here so that you can put a rubber band or a spring or something to hold that in place. This one doesn't have that, but you could probably do something similar to that. So this is what a darning egg looks like. So this might be something that you would put in your sock toe or sock heel or something like that if you needed to make a repair. So this is antique also. And this is something that you would use for a flatter surface here. Now the other thing that happened this week related to new vintage pattern acquisitions was that I used to teach at a yarn shop that was here in my neighborhood. It was called Needlework Unlimited. And the owner, Karen, wanted to retire in 2016. She couldn't get a qualified buyer. And so she had a deadline. And so in the middle of October, she didn't have a buyer. She's like, okay, I'm selling off the inventory, selling off the fixtures, and we'll be closed at the end of the year. And so that is what drove me ultimately to start doing weekly technique videos, and then eventually to do Casual Friday the following year, was because I wasn't teaching at the shop anymore because the shop wasn't there, and I had to figure out, what I wanted to do. Well, she's a member of the Minnesota Knitters Guild, and she saw the presentation I did on June 15th, the day before we left on our trip. I gave the monthly program where I was talking about this long-term project I have of knitting a sweater from each decade, and I was talking about sort of the evolution of knitting, of sweater knitting, and techniques and construction methods, whatever, through the 20th century. So she emailed me and said, oh, that was really interesting. She said, it occurs to me that you might be interested in my vintage patterns. She says, I'm looking to, eventually, get rid of them in the marketplace in some way, but I thought I'd give you first stab at it. So I went to her house yesterday. We live in the same neighborhood because the yarn shop is just a few blocks away. And I didn't know what she would have. I didn't know, what it was, but I was at her house for like an hour and a half. And it was really great to talk to somebody who has the perspective of a yarn shop owner too, and maybe knows a little bit more history. So she's, you know, a few years older than I am, and then she was been around knitting since she was a child. And so she has maybe more perspective of what was going on in the 70s and early 80s than I had. And so I told her what I was looking for. I love, you know, sweaters and socks are the two things I'm really interested in. And she's like, I've got women's magazines that sometimes include knitting patterns. I'm like, not really. You know, I really would just prefer knitting pattern books. So she started bringing over stacks of them, and I would just go through. So it was fascinating to just have that many to go through and just kind of be picky about it. Just kind of go through, you know, or when you have a big selection of them and say, well, which ones of these do I want? I don't want all of them necessarily. I really don't want to fill this room up with a bunch of Vogue knittings of every issue from going back to whenever. So I started going through, and there are a few things that I'll show you. I'm not going to go in depth because there's just too many, but there are a couple that I really thought were great. And one was, I immediately realized this is from the 1920s, and it was published in 1922. I'll do an overhead to show you of something that I thought was so fascinating. So this is Bear Brand and Busilla Blue Book, School and College Sweaters and Other Smart Sport Apparel. So as I've mentioned previously, sweaters were really athletic garments until the 1920s, when they kind of became also fashion items. But in this case, they were for college sports. You know, a lot of kids were playing team sports, or they were cheering on their college team, and they were wearing these sweaters for a lot of activities. So I'm going to go to the overhead and show you what was in here that I thought was super interesting. So this is the book that I got from Karen that was published in 1922. This is Bear Brand and Busilla. So Busilla stands for Bernard Ullman Company Incorporated, Lace, Linen, and Accessories. So it's the Bernard Ullman Company, and so they had Busilla and they had Bear Brand. Eventually they bought out Fleischer's, which is another popular brand at the time. But they always have, in their books, they always have copyright information, so you can see when it was published. This is 1922. They have various sweaters. They're pretty simple sweaters, but one of the things that you can see right here, you can see that the girls are playing basketball back here, and she's got this team color. You can do this in your team colors. She's got pockets, and she's wearing these bloomers and these stockings and these little shoes here. And she's got this fun beret. So then there's a different sweater here. So on this page, we have another sweater. This one appears to be in garter stitch, which I think is kind of unusual. A lot of times these things were in ribbing, Knit One Pro and ribbing, but this is in garter stitch. And she's playing basketball. She's got those bloomers and the stockings and the shoes. So now let me show you a photograph from a yearbook published in 1921 of a basketball team. It's San Diego High School, but it was the junior college was in the high school. That's my grandmother, Ella Buss, dressed up in her basketball uniform. Of course, it was San Diego. They didn't need a sweater. But they have the bloomers and the stockings, which I just love that. I want to show you this. So this is clearly from the 1940s, and I wasn't necessarily really looking for more 1940s patterns. I have, there's 8 books right here that were all published in the 1940s that are full of sweater patterns. The reason I haven't picked a 1940s pattern is because of the overwhelming choice I have, not because I can't find the right thing. It's literally overwhelming. So I haven't really been looking for more 1940s patterns, but this particular book really caught my eye, and I'll show you in the overhead in particular what I thought was really interesting about this. This 1940s booklet has, it has some interesting sweaters. I really love the 1940s sweaters. What I don't love is that so many of them are knit at the superfine gauge, which I've been knitting this 1960s sweater at, but at least they're short sleeve maybe that will help. I don't know. But this is one reason I've been kind of putting off doing a 1940s. But what I thought was really interesting was this here at the back. Let me zoom in. So Billy, who watches my channel and is very much into the vintage stuff, was knitting a 1940s sweater, I think about around a year ago, and she was trying to figure out how to pad out the shoulders. And I thought this was so interesting, all of the different ways that they have shoulder pads. And I don't know if so, I haven't looked at these patterns closely enough to see if some of them are saying use this style, use this style, use that style. But I find this fascinating, that these are the different ways that they were getting their shoulder pads to hold up. I have not seen this in any of my other 1940s sweater books, and maybe I just haven't looked closely enough, but I really think this is interesting. So if any of you have 1940s pattern books, if you've seen something like this, let me know, because I just think that is incredible. So when we were traveling, it's been so long since I've really been out of the house. It was really interesting to see how my brain functioned in other locations. Like we're seeing different things, we're traveling, we're doing different things. And it just caused my brain to think about a lot of different and new things. And I was like taking notes. Oh, I want to try this. I want to try this. And when we were in Scottsdale, I had this idea, I don't even know where it came from, that I wanted to see if it would pan out. And so I thought I would show you kind of when I get an idea, an initial idea, and I have my ideas about how it might work, what the first steps of that process are, and how this is not typically the end result. That this is like you get an idea and you figure out what your experiment is going to be. Here's what I'm going to try. And then as you go through that experiment, you see, oh, that didn't work as well as I thought, or maybe I want to do this instead. So I want to show you just this little tiny sample. I had leftover sock yarn from the socks I had knit, and those are the needles I had with me. And so I made this little top-down hat that had specific elements that I wanted to try. And I want to show you what I did and then what I realized I need to do for the next experiment if I want to continue going forward with this. So I don't really want to go into a lengthy explanation of everything that I did in this, but basically I had an idea for a top-down hat that had a stockinette hem where I wouldn't have to do a bind off followed by seaming it. So I wouldn't have to create this stockinette hem, a turning ridge, more stockinette, bind off, and then seam it, or seam live stitches to the back, which would typically be what you would have to do if you were working top down. I wanted to see if it would work to use double knitting as the method of producing this hem, and then what would be the best way to close or fasten off the bottom. So that was what this experiment was. And so this is really like an experiment, and I learned a lot from it. I learned what worked, what didn't work, and I also saw what I want to try differently. So I tried a cast-on method. I used Judy's Magic Cast-On. It's okay. I want to compare that to using a pinhole cast-on or Turkish cast-on. So I have two other choices for how I might want to start this. I see that the transition from the regular stockinette to the double knitting, those stitches are too big. I used two different size needles here. I used a larger needle here, like a size 2 here and a size 0 here. I should have used the 0 at that transition. I waited until I had doubled the number of stitches I needed, which is I needed to do that for double knitting. So the next time I would use the smaller needle to do the knit front backs to double the stitches. So I would, as soon as I was done with regular stockinette, I would just switch to the smaller needle. I used, four different ways of closing off this edge. And I have a couple of ideas for what I could do even differently than that, that I would want to try. So, and I also have an idea for creating more length in the front, which is typically something you would want to do if you were knitting this in a traditional way. You would work the front a row longer than you would work the inside to keep it from rolling out like this. So I learned a lot from this process, and I have some experiments I want to try. So what I just wanted to show you was kind of a peek into getting an idea and then seeing how it works out. That if it doesn't work out the way you expected the first time, well, then you say, okay, what am I going to do in experiment number 2? What are the things that I could change, or what would I want to improve, or what do I want to try? So this is phase 1. There will likely be a number of experiments in order for me to actually end up with something that I liked. And then I would have to decide, is that really worth it? Is all of that experiment worth doing that way or not? But for me, this is just information gathering and experimentation, and it's phase 1. So you may be wondering, well, what's going on with your 1960s project? I was working on it in the car on the road trip, and I got to a point where I thought, so I'm not sure the sleeve is actually getting to be too long for how big around it is. Did I miscalculate something? Did my gauge change? And you can't measure things in the car. And so I put it to the side, and I took it out the other day and to actually evaluate what was going on. And I think I figured out what I need to do going forward. So it just needed a few days away from it and some time to think. And in the meantime, I didn't have another project. I had wanted or thought that I would start a project that I was working on last fall, where I'm reverse engineering a sweater, a commercially knit sweater that's got a big hole in the elbow. I just wanted to reknit it because I really loved this sweater. And I wasn't interested in fixing it. I've talked about this before. When I looked up all of my charts and my notes, I realized I didn't really have that many notes or charts. I had been focusing on how I was going to work and make the pocket, what I was going to do with the pocket, and I hadn't really made some decisions. And so when you're reverse engineering or designing from scratch, you have to provide the instructions yourself. You have to do the calculations, you have to write out your instructions, you have to figure out what you're going to do. And I hadn't really done that. I hadn't gone that far. So I have to finish designing that sweater. I can't just start knitting it because I have to work through some numbers and calculations and things. So one of the vintage booklets that I got a couple of weeks ago that I showed you last week, in last week's Casual Friday, is some patterns that Rhea sent me from Canada. And one of them was this book from 1950. And there was a pattern in there, a sweater in there, that I thought, oh, that's interesting. And it's this, where is it? It's this one right here. This raglan jacket. Now, it looks pretty plain. There's nothing particularly remarkable about it, but it had some details that I felt were very interesting. So in this long-term project that I have of knitting a sweater from each decade, I have a couple of things that I'm looking for when I select a particular pattern. Number one, it has to really kind of represent that decade. Like, you have to look at it and think, oh, that's 1950s. One of the things that a lot of people who knit vintage things look for is something that they would want to wear. Maybe they have vintage style kind of a aesthetic that they follow, but maybe they, so maybe they want it to look like it's from that era, or maybe they just look at it and they can look past the hairstyles and the weird poses, and they can imagine, oh, that actually would really work really well in the 2020s. So, but when I'm looking at something, I want it to be like, yes, that is 1950s. So that can come in conflict with my desire to pick something that I would want to wear. So being emblematic of the decade is more important to me than me actually ending up wearing this, because this is all part of the context of this whole century's worth of sweaters. So the second thing is that I need to learn something from it. So I might see a sweater that I really love, and maybe it even does really represent that decade really well, but there's nothing interesting or different about the construction from anything that I've done before. It's really standard. It's like, okay, this is exactly how we do this today. So I'm not learning anything. And so my goal ultimately is to learn some things. So I'm looking at this 1950s sweater, and I'm thinking, well, that's really interesting. That raglan shaping has a really interesting stitch pattern going along the seam line, and it has that pattern, that stitch pattern going along the pockets, which are diagonal. So I have done pockets, like there's a sweater called the Wonderful Wallaby. It's a pullover sweater with a hood, but it's got like a sweatshirt pocket in the front, like tubular pocket. Some people call that a kangaroo pocket. I think they call it that because it's in the center. But if you think about it, that is nothing like what a kangaroo pocket would be like, because a kangaroo pocket would be open on the top. So I've done that kind of pocket. That's different construction than in something that is open in the front and you have each of the two halves on the side. So I thought, well, those are some compelling elements to me. And then it has 3/4 length sleeves, which I've been talking about the past few weeks. I don't really care for. So this is a jacket that has 3/4 length sleeves. So they end here and then they kind of poof out. So if I were actually going to make this thing for me in the 2020s, I would change the sleeves. I'd probably make it longer in the body. I'd change the sleeves. I'd do, a bunch of different things. But I'm trying to make something that's emblematic of the 1950s. And so I'm looking at those sleeves. I'm like, okay, I'm just suck it up and I'm just going to make it with the 3/4 length sleeves that poof out. Like, this is very 50s, and it's interesting. And it has, the collar even is interesting because it uses a mitered corner for the collar. So there are a few construction details that I just think are really interesting. So that is why I've chosen it. And I looked at the yarn weight. It needs a yarn weight that I have sitting here right next to me that I just got in the mail. I don't have anything else that would be heavy enough. Otherwise I would have to buy it or just pick a different pattern. So this to me is like a perfect. And really what I love about it is that 4.5 stitches per inch is so much better than the 7.5 stitches per inch that I've been working on in this 1960s sweater that's just driving me crazy. So this will be a much quicker knit. So I'm going to go to the overhead and show you some of the things that I've been working through to kind of understand more how this construction works. Because one of the things I do before I start any project, this is true in general, is I create a spreadsheet that basically lays the entire I go through the pattern and look at the stitch counts, where the shaping, and I'm calculating the total number of stitches. I'm just looking at what things are happening at the same time. And so basically I have a spreadsheet that has all of the pattern in it, but with all of the stitch counts and running totals and percentage complete and all that kind of thing. Because I like to know what the total number of stitches are, and it gives me an idea how long it's probably going to take me to knit, and then I can keep track of my yarn usage as I'm going through the first ball of yarn. Do I really have enough or not? And this is particularly important in these vintage patterns where you almost always have to make a yarn substitution, and they never tell you how many yards of yarn you're going to need. So I do this spreadsheet, but in order for me to do the spreadsheet and do those calculations, I have to understand what's going on in the instructions. So the pocket instructions, I was like reading through them, was trying to understand what was going on, keeping track of things in my head. A lot of times I can draw a schematic, but in this case I couldn't draw a schematic. I had to build it in a different way. So that's what I'm going to show you in the overhead. This is the sweater that I'm going to do for my 1950s project. So I really like this detail along the raglan seam. So this is knit flat in pieces. That was extremely common back then. So this has got to be seamed. The method that they are calling for seaming was very interesting to me. And so I did some swatching and experimentation to see how that seaming method worked, and I actually like it quite a lot. That was one of the things that I wanted to try out, because I'd like to use the techniques that they call for in the pattern if it makes sense, particularly if it's something that I wouldn't normally use. Like, oh, were they onto something? Is this really a better technique? And so I will try, in a swatch at least, their technique to see what I think of it. And if I like it, then I will use it for the project. If I don't, then I will use the method that I would normally use. This pocket, I was reading through the instructions. I was trying to understand what was going on. So I ended up creating a little, I took pieces of paper and I numbered them and I taped them together. So this is my little, the way I walked it through so that I could understand. So the first thing that you do is you cast on stitches for the pocket line, for part of the pocket lining. So you're knitting this little rectangle that's 4 inches wide, and you knit it up to here, and you keep these stitches live. So you have them on a needle or a stitch holder or whatever. So you've knit this and you keep those stitches live. The second thing you do is to cast on all of the stitches you need for the width of the front. And you knit them to the same length that you have knit the pocket. So now you have 2 needles that have live stitches on them. So the third step is on this piece that has all of the stitches. You knit across, in this case it's 10 stitches, it's like 2.5 inches worth of the stitches. So you knit across these first stitches. This is the side edge here, the side seam. So you knit across these 10 stitches, then you put these on a holder. You're not going to be knitting these live stitches right now. Instead, you knit across all of these pocket stitches. So you've got 10 stitches here, and in this case 18. So now you've got these 28 stitches. And that's what this number 3 is. So you're going to keep going up all the way. So if I look on the back, so it's 10 stitches, you've got these 28 stitches and you're knitting all the way up here, but you've got this edge flap. This is the original pocket and you're knitting this right here and it's attached right there. So when you get up to here, again, you put them on a stitch holder, live stitches, you come back to the ones that were held here, and now you're working across these back and forth, and this is when you're shaping. You're doing the little stitch pattern and you're doing your decreases to shape, to create that diagonal line right here. So then now when you're back up here again to the same length, now at this point you can knit across all of the stitches back and forth to continue knitting the front. So it's in 5 parts. So now that I understand what's going on, I can make some plans for how I actually want to knit this. If we look on the back here, we've got that initial pocket flap right here, and then we've got this part of the pocket right here. So these are open edges, and the bottom is open as well. When this sweater is finished, there's no ribbing or anything. It's all stockinette. The idea is you do some single crochet all the way across the edge. And when you get to where the bottom of the pocket is, you're going to go through both of those layers when you do your single crochet. So that's how you're going to seal the bottom. But then what you're supposed to do is come back and just sew up on the back, so to close those edges. So this is where I'm going to use a different technique, because I know that I don't like sewing up along that edge right there, because I tend to go off. I worry about, am I poking through to the other side when I'm seaming? So I like to use a different technique when I am doing these kind of pocket linings. I did it on a previous sweater. When I did my World War I sweater, I did a similar thing. So I will, as I'm knitting the sweater, I will show you what I'm doing. But essentially what you do is on the edges here, you work those in garter stitch. So you create a bump, a garter bump on each side, so that as I'm actually knitting back and forth on here and creating this, that I attach to this pocket on either side of that as I'm knitting back and forth. And I would do the same up here, so that as I'm knitting back and forth across here, then I can attach to this pocket edge. So I'll have to do a little bit of swatching just to make sure that my idea is going to work for this. I believe it will. Sometimes just drawing a regular schematic can help, but in this case, because there were so many parts that were being held and then being worked and being held, I needed to build it like this. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.